What are the odds? From Crack Addict to CEO by Mike Lindell, published 2019. This is all Colton owns no copyrights to the reading of this materials for educational purposes only. Chapter 11 Coke times 10. With the Blues Brothers blowout and the Vikings' dream season in late 1998, I was riding high, but January brought what turned out to be an earthquake year. I know the exact day things headed south, Friday, January 15th, 1999. We were headed into a huge weekend. The Vikings had gone 15-1, the first team ever to win 15 regular season games. The NFC Championship was set for that Sunday, the Vikings versus the Atlanta Falcons, and we were 11-point favorites. The whole town and really the whole state was high on victory. We all had our sights set on the Super Bowl, our first in 22 years. This time, we were going to win. This being Schmitty's, we weren't confining the party to game day only. I had planned promotions to draw people in all weekend and expected the place to be an absolute zoo. As she sometimes did, Karen had agreed to come in and help out behind the bar beginning on Friday. I was rushing around the house that morning, getting ready to head over to the bar when Karen looked at me and said, "I'm not coming in." I stopped dead in my tracks and whirled around. What? I had already tried to hire extra bartenders for the weekend, but that with the big game on top, couldn't find any. There was no way I could handle this crowd myself. I tried to talk her into coming in. We usually had each other's backs, but this time Karen made a stand. She had been up all night partying and she wasn't coming in, period. We'd been arguing more lately, our patience worn down by hectic schedules, being apart all the time, and especially by drinking and drugs. This argument, however, escalated into a full blown fight. My rage kicked in, and a kind that crept up on me more and more. I was furious. She was furious. We both said and did things we had never said or done before. Karen stormed into the bedroom and locked the door. I stormed after her and kicked the door in. Then I stopped. I would never lay a hand on Karen, but I felt betrayed. As far as I was concerned, she was messing with our livelihood, this being maybe the biggest money making weekend of the year. I felt abandoned, my pride wounded, and I wanted her to know that if I wanted to come into my bedroom, I damn well would. Later, I felt terrible about breaking the door and tried repairing it myself. That, too, was a disaster. I went into Schmitty's and ran things myself that Friday, fueled by thick lines of cocaine. I was angry all day, so much so that I was glad my wife and I weren't speaking. I didn't want to talk to her, and she didn't want to talk to me. Things were bad, but the next day they became horrific. Early Saturday evening, Dean called me. He was so distraught I couldn't even understand what he was saying. Not an hour later, Dean's brother, Mark, called me. "Dean's dead," Mark said. "He shot himself." That night, I sat outside Schmitty's for an hour and sobbed. I was in shock. My mind reeled, and for a long time afterwards, I asked myself, what else could I have done? What else I could have done? Sunday, the day after Dean's suicide, those of us who had been close to him walked around in a state of disbelief. But our friend had been living out of state for 20 years, so most people in town were more concerned about the Vikings playoff game. As people crowded into Schmitty's, I had to set my feelings aside. The team lost, blowing a 7-point lead in the final 4 minutes. then losing by a field goal in overtime. The regulars were crushed. They filed out one by one to drown their sorrows elsewhere. After everyone left us, I sat alone in the bar, shell shocked. Karen and I were still fighting, so I never went home that night. Just stayed in the bar doing coke all night long. The next morning, I decided to keep Schmitty's closed. It was like I was sealed in a bubble of sorrow, with no communication in and none going out. Finally, my friend Tony got worried and called Skelly. Mike's never shut the bar down. I think you need to go check on him. Skelly did, and on Tuesday morning I opened my eyes and saw him passed out beside me on the floor of the bar. Looking around, I realized the janitor had come in and swept up around Skelly and me as though we were chalk outlines in the middle of a crime scene. That was the terrible beginning of a terrible year that would change the course of my life. Not long afterward, I was down in the basement at Schmitty's. I was out of coke, and a friend of mine said, "Here, take this." I looked down and saw a crack rack in his hand. Vaguely, I remembered the pact I had made with Kevin Chase. We weren't going to do crack. We weren't going to become creepy and paranoid like those guys at Toad's house. On the other hand, I was out of coke, and it had been an almost universally crappy year. I looked down at the rock. "What's it like?" I asked my friend. "It's a lot like coke," he said. Well, it was coke, sort of. I knew crack was made from coke, with baking soda, water, and heat. I did not realize that it is an almost completely different drug. With the first rock in my hand, I decided it wouldn't hurt to fill in the gap in my supply just this once. So I smoked it, and nothing. It was no big deal. But the second time, the high was magnified beyond anything I'd ever felt. When I inhaled, there was a whoosh, and I was instantly there. It was Coke times 10, at least. I smoked another rock and another. Over the next few hours, I also noticed that crack didn't seem to carry the negative side effects of coke. With coke, I was tired but couldn't sleep. I wasn't hungry but wanted to eat. With crack, I couldn't sleep and eat. All that was the devil's lie, of course. This would soon flip. Not only would I not want to eat, I would not want to sleep. All I wanted was more crack. I tried it a few more times in the weeks ahead, picking up some here and there from friends, including the paranoid ones who'd stopped coming to the bar. One day I talked one of my dealers, Ray, into driving all the way out to Schmitty's from Minneapolis. He pulled up outside the bar and I walked out to meet him. He rolled down his window and handed me a baggie of Coke. Then I asked him a question that had really been worrying me. "Hey Ray," I said, "do you know anyone that's done crack, then went back to just doing soft cocaine?" Ray stared at me hard, and his face became a question mark. "What?" I repeated my question, and his eyes narrowed. "You didn't do it, did you?" "Yeah, I did." Ray's face collapsed. "I told you, never, ever smoke crack," he said. "You're done now. You're through. You just ruined your life." So, always try to maintain a clear conscience before God and everyone else. Acts 24:16. Pictures, buy the book to see them. Flying Cloud Theater, 1977. Closing time at the Flying Cloud Drive-In Theater in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. I didn't mind mopping the floor. In fact, I found it relaxing. Super value, missing an E. Oh, that's how it's spelled. Mike came to get our money. Book was with me. Physical force may be needed. Call me. Hardy's bag with Bookie's threat. Mike came to get our money. Book was with me. Physical force may be needed. Call me. Exclamation point. Wow. Pictures of everything. You have to buy the book then. Wow. Pictures of everything. Book two. Crack. Minnesota and casinos everywhere. 2002 to 2007. Crack. Chapter 12. Storm warning. From inside Schmitty's, I could hear the sounds of a growing storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance like drum rolls on sheet metal. Rain poured through the parking lot and bent the trees at Steger Lake. It was about 2 a.m., and I was closing up, tidying behind the bar, counting the money in the till. I found there wasn't as much as I would have liked. Again. It was the summer of 2002, and a bar down the block called Floyd's had been siphoning away my business for a couple of years. 2002. Siphoning away my business for a couple of years. The new owners bought the place at about the same time I started using crack. They did a good job creating a fun atmosphere where customers felt at home, just like I had. They also started bringing in live bands, something we didn't have room for at Schmitty's. I responded with one of my trademark grand gestures, organizing all-out party field trips I called Schmitty's Goes to Vegas. After I gambled away our vacation money in 1997 and the Flamingo Casino pit boss comped Karen and me the luxury suite, I had learned a lot about comps. Like most regular gamblers, I had a player's card for each casino where I spent significant amounts of time. I discovered that when I used these cards, the house tracked my metrics. What games did I play? How long did I play? And most importantly, how much was I betting per roll or per hand? If the metrics rose high enough, there were perks, meals, rooms, show tickets, all for free. Casinos will give gamblers pretty much anything to keep them gambling. To maximize my comps, I promoted the idea that I was a big time player, which meant trying to look and act like I had money when I didn't. It wasn't long before the Riviera, the Stardust, and the Westward Ho, my favorite casinos on the strip, had each issued me a gold player's card. That entitled me to things like suites, unlimited food, even limousines. After a while, I learned I could extend my comps to others, so I organized a pair of 4-day trips for the regulars and friends. The Schmitty's crew was as obnoxious outside the bar as in, which meant the flights to and from were just as entertaining at being at Schmitty's. But for me, these trips were also a lot of work. I wanted to make sure each and every person was taken care of and having a great time. Plus, I had to play 4 hours a day at each of my three gold card casinos to keep the comps flowing. On each of these trips in 2000, a friend ran out of cash and took out a $100 marker at the Stardust. A marker is like an IOU, a way of borrowing money from the house to place a bet. But as with bad checks, an unpaid marker is a felony in Nevada, so it's critical to pay it back. Since I was a gold card holder, Stardust let me sign for the friend's marker. I quickly scribbled my signature on this minor IOU and forgot all about it. Each trip was a huge success, but even taking my regulars to Vegas didn't stop some from defecting to Floyd's. That really hurt me. I felt I'd poured a lot of love into Schmitty's and into my customers, and their defection felt like a betrayal. The real story that I was also defecting was harder for me to accept. In the 90s, when I was building the business, I worked double digit hours, 7 days a week, tending bar and running the softball and pool leagues. After my family, Schmitty's was the most important thing in my life, and I poured all my energy into it. Now, though, crack sucked away my passion little by little. I was becoming a clock puncher at my own business. I rationalized my increasing absences after full weekends of entertaining my customers. I reasoned that I didn't really need to be at Schmitty's on Monday nights. Then, before long, it was also Tuesday nights. And so it went on. And so it went. Crack was incompatible with running the bar. I used to run down to the basement to do a quick line of coke and reappear behind the bar as the life of the party. Cocaine had become just another recreational drug. But crack required secrecy, and keeping that secret was a lot of work. The drug carried a stigma, and I certainly didn't want anyone to know I was smoking crack. When I finished counting the till money, I tucked it in a zip up bank bag and walked into the storm, locking the doors behind me. Rain poured in sheets from the dark morning sky, and I pulled my jacket up over my head as I hurried to my truck. Feeling low about the night's skimpy earnings, I cranked the engine and turned on the wipers. They beat back and forth, smearing the view, but the handwriting on the wall was becoming clear. Crack was now more important to me than my livelihood. Crack takes you down fast. I was watching it happen all around me. One day, the wife of my friend John called. John had been staying away from the house for long periods, she said. Also, their bank accounts were disappearing. John's wife, along with his mother, suspected he had a gambling problem and asked me to come over and help them do an intervention. This remained an ironic feature of my life that friends and family would call me to talk other addicts off the ledge, even though they knew I was an addict myself. This happened many times, and I still don't quite understand it. It was 2 in the afternoon when I arrived at John's house, and a dozen of his family members were already there. This last time he was gone for 3 days, John's wife said the minute I walked in. He's cheating on me. I knew it. I know it. His mother chimed in. He said he was at Mystic Lake Casino. Many times I'd cleaned out the till at Schmitty's and headed into Mystic Lake with friends. Taking friends with me was kind of like an insurance policy in case I lost right away. I could always get them to give me a short term loan against the Schmitty's till. I later learned that when Skelly came with me, he'd hide behind the slot machine so I couldn't find him when I needed more cash. He didn't have a problem loaning me money, he just didn't want to see me go deeper in the hole. Now I look sadly at John's wife and mom. You're both wrong, I said. John isn't cheating on you, and he's not gambling. He's on crack. Surprise washed over both their faces. Really? His wife said. She sounded somewhat in disbelief, but also strangely relieved. You don't get it, I said. Crack is the most powerful drug I have ever done in my life. After the fourth or fifth time I used it, crack turned on me, causing terrible paranoia. I would be filled with fear and not know why. I found myself lifting the corners of window curtains, peeking out, searching for something that wasn't there. The paranoia thing is common among crack users. You can be sitting with your best friend since high school, wondering if he's an undercover cop. At first, the paranoia hits you 2 out of 10 times you smoke crack, then 3 or 4 out of 10. Pretty soon, it's every time. I would find myself shut in a house with strangers, isolating myself just like the paranoid guys at Toad's house. Once I got to that point, I would smoke a rock, then take everything, including the hot pipe, and hide it in a hole in the wall, a secret pocket cut into the couch, under a sink behind the pipes, anywhere I thought no one else would look. Then, 10 minutes or so later, I'd pull it out and smoke another rock, then hide it again and start all over. Everything about crack required secrecy and cunning. I was always making small makeshift pipes. I'd buy a tire pressure tester and take the insides out, or maybe use a wrench socket or a glass pipe. To complete the pipe, I'd buy a chore boy scrubber, tear a piece off, and scrunch it up inside the pipe so that it functioned like a screen in a tobacco pipe. Whenever I arrived at a store checkout counter with a spoon, baking soda, and a chore boy, I was sure the clerk knew exactly why I wanted that stuff and was just waiting for me to hit the parking lot before calling the cops. The paranoia that came with crack was exhausting. Yet, even with all the fear and secrecy, even as I knew my behavior was getting stranger and stranger, the high I got from crack was so euphoric that I was willing to endure it all rather than stop. At the exact moment I revealed to John's family that his real problem was crack, John came walking down the stairs. "What's going on?" he said, looking around at the familiar faces crowded into his living room. One by one, his family spoke. "This is an intervention," they said. They were worried about him and had already reserved him a spot at Granite Falls, Minnesota treatment facility that would help him with his gambling addiction. Gambling addiction, I thought. "I told you guys he needs to go in for crack addiction too," I blurted. John glared at me like I'd stabbed him in the back. I understood his sense of betrayal. After all, I didn't want my friends and family to know I was hooked on crack. But if John's family was already at the intervention stage, I felt they needed to know the truth, even if I couldn't be saved. Maybe it wasn't too late for John. I returned my friend's gaze. "John, we've talked about this," I said. "We both know this is the most powerful drug either of us has ever done. We have no control over it." There was nothing he could say at that point. Reluctantly, but to please his family, John left that day for Granite Falls. As it turned out, John could not be saved. After a 28-day addiction program, he returned home and came out as a full-blown crack addict, now with nothing left to hide. I had tried to help but failed. I also failed to control my own crack use, and by now Karen was into crack too. Even though I was functioning better than some of my friends, I noticed I was starting to pick up more of their strange behaviors. While smoking crack alone or with friends, I'd run out of the drug and start crawling around the floor, searching for any little scrap that might be a piece of an unsmoked rock. It's called farming, and every cracked addict has done it. Farming. And remember my friend Toad? For all the time I had known him, Toad put in the hours at that machine shop, never cut corners, and hung on to his inheritance. Then he tried crack. Remember that neat, clean house across from the Dairy Queen? It was now a full blown crack house. Toad had papered over the windows with cardboard, cutting in peepholes and slits to accommodate the crackhead paranoia. The yard, which he had always kept neatly clipped, became overgrown with weeds. After a while, he stopped paying his electricity bill, and the power company shut off his lights. Toad just snuck a long extension cord onto his neighbor's property and stole power from them. Crack had its claws in my friend so deep that he was smoking it around the clock. Since the high lasts only 5 or 10 minutes, Toad started using a timer to keep from running through his supply too quickly. His increasingly bizarre behavior cost him his job. Now, at lightning speed, he was burning through his money his dad had left him. I had always loved debating with Toad over everything from new inventions to the existence of God. Now I was watching him free fall toward disaster. One day I was at his house. I confronted him about it. "Look at this place," I said, gesturing around at the mess. "Where does it end, Toad? You spent Almost all your dad's money. Where does it end? Toad's eyes narrowed to slits like the ones he'd cut in his window cardboard. When it's gone. When it's gone, he whispered. In the voice that came out of his mouth, I didn't recognize my friend. The difference in Toad, the diligent, nice guy who wanted to please his parents, and the man I saw before me brought me a deep sadness. This Toad sounded desperate, determined, defiant, and lost all at the same time. I'll never forget it. When I pulled into my driveway on the night of the huge summer storm, I saw lights on in the kitchen, but then lightning was forking down around the neighborhood. The thunder that followed sounded like explosions at a demolition site. And inside, I found Darren sitting at the kitchen table, watching the storm through the open sliding glass doors. Hey, are you the only one up? I asked. Yes, the thunder woke me up. Haven't seen a lightning storm like this before, I said, glancing outside. It was like watching a light show at eye level. That's how close the lightning was. I walked over to the fridge. Are you hungry? I could cook us I could cook us up some deer steaks. He smiled and nodded. I put the steaks on the stove and sat down next to him. I was in a reflective mood, and for a few minutes I watched lightning flicker on Darren's face as it danced around the trees outside. I was in love with my kids. You know how it is. Raising them seems to take forever, but that precious time also flies by in the blink of an eye. Darren, who had barely made it into the world, was already 12. Charlie was 13 by then. I remember when he was about 18 months old, we had to take him to the emergency room for dehydration, and we couldn't figure out why until we noticed Lizzie over in the corner drinking Charlie's baby bottle. It turned out she'd been stealing his bottles from his crib, drinking them dry, and putting them back empty. She was 2.5 then. Now she was 14, heading into high school. Heather, a spirited preschooler when Karen and I got married, was now driving. Where had the time gone? For 15 years, Karen and I had been so close. Now we were both into crack, and it was beginning to chip away at the integrity of our family. The pace of family life and running Schmitty's had always kept us busy, but the secrecy that developed around our crack use caused us to spend even more time away from our kids. Keeping our addiction away from the house and the kids meant we'd go out, we'd go hang out with our crack smoking friends. Also, I often went off to smoke crack on my own, at Toad's house, for example. This combined with the awful crack paranoia caused Karen even greater anxiety. She'd always worried I was cheating on her, and now my longer absences magnified her fear. Darren and I sat watching the storm until the deer steaks were done. I pulled them off the stove and we dug in, listening to the rolling thunder and the patter of rain. Still in a nostalgic mood, I started telling him stories about my life. I can't remember how the subject came up. Maybe it was that I knew Schmitty's was headed south and I'd begun to think about career options. But I began telling Darren about my days as a professional card counter. If you're not familiar with card counting, I'll tell you how it works. A card counter is an advantage player who tries to overcome the house's built in advantage in the game of blackjack by keeping mental track of the cards as they are played. By doing so, he's also tracking cards that haven't been played. As a result, he is able to predict with a fair degree of accuracy which cards will be played next. I learned the trade back in the 80s from a card counting master named Vas Spanos. In Spanos' system, players memorize matrices, tables that quantify the advantages to the house versus the player by assigning each combination of cards a positive or negative value. And you blackjack, you know the odds always favor the house. However, using probability as his or her secret weapon, a good card counter actually has a steady advantage over the house of about 1.5%. That's why it isn't gambling, I explained to Darren, but it also isn't really a lot of fun. Counting involves keeping careful track of cards played to build your advantage, but as a dealer turns up cards from a deck or a shoe, the advantage seesaws back and forth between players and the house. To come out on top, you have to sit at the tables for hours and hours running through the matrices in your head. grinding it out. It's a job, an occupation, I told Darren, clearing the mess from our little 3 a.m. snack. But if you stick with it, you can make a good living. Why did you stop? Darren said. I paused and looked at him. Well, when I was in his course, Vas Spano said I was one of the best he'd ever seen. But he also said I'd never be a successful card counter because I was a gambler at heart. Vas was correct. I always became impatient with the plodding pace and pressed my bets too far, except for the one time I did it right. By the summer of 1983, I had already tried Voss's system, then given up counting. Now I was working on my uncle's pig farm in Iowa. Uncle Al raised feeder pigs, the kind people buy to fill their freezers with pork. I was putting in 80 to 100 hours a week at $5 an hour, slopping, cleaning stalls, delivering tiny little piglets, clipping tails, clipping teeth, yes, teeth, and nursing sick and injured pigs back to health. But that was the loneliest year of my life. To be continued, page 90.